Now, we showed how the X of the total eclipse was NASA's perception from outer space, and the eye that crossed the U.S. map was followed by a dark shadow path. When the eye closed over the lone mountain, prevailing darkness loomed for 2 minutes and 44 seconds. Unknowingly to NASA, their perception was the sign of the life code, or we could say it is new life in the womb. The repeat of words, numbers, names, sound-alike names, and events are God signs. Wow, are we going to see and hear repeats now? First, may we cover the sign of the X's. That sounds like the word of Texas. I think we covered that in the last video. It was called Tidal X, more than what meets the eye. So every time I hear the sound X's, I'm going to think of Texas. So we had the crossing of the total eclipse. And then the life code. And here is Planned Parenthood's Tidal X that was called the cash cow. Now the new kid on the block, or the once not seen before sign, what took me back to Florida, to the hurricane crossings in 2004. I had drawn an X as it related to the crossing of Hurricane Charlie as he entered at Port Charlotte and exited at Daytona Beach. Francis and Jean came from the Atlantic and made landfall at St. Port Lucie. I know that was Francis. Jean was near that point. But they exited at Cedar Key. And then there was a Ivan II. He was the brother to Ivan I. And he came down out of the mountains in the north and traveled south to Cape Canaveral around that point. He made landfall as a Cat 1. And maybe when he crossed, he was a tropical storm. But he reinforced the meeting point, the center of the X, that was etched by the other 3 hurricanes, and he too exited at Cedar Key. Of course, Cedar Key had sinkholes a couple of weeks later due to the stretching of the bands by 3 exiting hurricanes along the ocean on the Gulf side. No one had ever connected those skid mark dots to 3 whipping tail hurricanes and or tornadoes that popped out of the belly of the hurricanes. So when the X exposed itself, that was meaningful because all 4 hurricanes had met in the middle and they had centered to the only mountain that stands on the snakehead of Florida. Have you ever questioned why Florida signifies the head of a snake? Or could be an alligator where they crawl? Well, we have that explained in another video when we're talking about that lone mountain. Well, to me, this center point, that was the vortex, the fueling station for the surrounding swamps and inland lakes. To check out the center of the X, the name Tower, Gardens, and Spook Hill would rung a bell. So it deemed necessary to call my sister who had been there. By the way, her name, Frances Jean, was a sign of confirmation that perhaps I was on the right path with these piecing principles. She also confirmed why the name Spook Hill existed. She said when their car rolled uphill on a downhill incline, while it was in neutral, it was spooky. This phenomenon is explained, like I said, when we get into the depth of Tower Gardens and how it connects to the Garden of the Gods in southern Illinois in so many ways. It is spooky. So the X at the time, drawn over the map of Florida, was not related to the life code, and the meteorologist never mentioned the fact that these 4 hurricanes in 2004 drew an X pattern and they centered to a vortex point. At the time, many questions were left in my mind, but the idea that the sluggish swamps needed stirring and pulse boosted seemed reasonable, particularly when oceanographers said the waters along the Florida coast had grown a bright, lush green carpet shortly after the hurricanes. The thought occurred: the oxygen tank of the hurricanes flooded the floor with oxygen producing plants so they could once again support a lively environment for the marine life and a strong current. This all made sense, but as soon as the series creation in the womb began, the X drawn relating to the pulse boosting hurricanes now had been confirmed when the sign of the X actually stood for life in the womb. To me, the inland bodies of water had to be awakened. Their pulse and current was too sluggish, and they had to be pulse boosted in order to be in sync with the bordering ocean waters of the Atlantic and the Gulf. This stirring in the middle was aligned to the stretch bands of the sinkholes on the Gulf side at Cedar Key. Stirring and stretching, they're one and the same. So we have several videos forthcoming that goes into the depth of why the mysteries of this lone mountain, and furthermore, like we said previously, you will know why the state of Florida looks like the head of a striking snake. The Florida Keys show the fang. So there's a reason for all of the above. And as we delve into the mysteries with principles that make sense, you will have a visual understanding of this mystery mountain. You'll no longer be a mystery. So 13 years later, now that was from 2004 to 2017, the X that was drawn across the U.S. map by NASA's perception now had greater meaning, especially when the eye closed and brought prevailing darkness over the lone mountain, the Garden of the Gods. Two lone mountains with the name Garden and a history of mysteries kept my eyes and ears open, and I naturally questioned if this had something to do with the forewarning of hurricanes as well. How could you not think such, especially if you are a dot connector? So just considering that the vortex on the run, the traveling total eclipse, was brushing the vanes relative to a fire-bound volcanic chain, and Mount Hood was in the range of the Dark Shadow Path, and so was the vanes of Yellowstone and the New Madrid Fault Line, it seemed reasonable there might be a rash of fires out of the west or in the northwest where the total eclipse crossed. So now the question came up about the crossing of the four hurricanes as they related to the sign of the X. Now, I'm not saying that forewarnings were in the scope, but they were not surprising when the fires and floods broke out about the same time. So just following the principles of balance, of nature, it seemed reasonable to draw another X in order for the building pressure of the total eclipse to have 8 spokes in place, which is relative to a balancing wheel. Think about this. The X was traveling, the eye of the funnel was traveling across the map. So a wheel, well, that was concise. These spokes represented equivalent release valves, whether it be fire or water. The obvious of fire brushing fire was not an obscure link, but neither was the hurricanes when considering the X drawn over Florida as it related to the aftermath sign of the crossing of the 4 hurricanes. The word crossing seemed to be synonymous with fire, hurricanes, and flooding waters. And in a sense, the sun, 1 million degrees hot, touched the earth on the day of the crossing of the total eclipse. But that temp had to be balanced by the dark shadow path that followed the eye of the funnel all the way across the U.S. map. The dark shadow path compared to a stirring and whipping tail. All the while it tempered the sun that served on that day to enliven and wake things up. Maybe that was the people of the U.S. as well. Now, there's a lot of discrepancies considering the timelines, but I gathered my information as much as possible at the time of happening. If I have any fallacies in the data, I stand to be corrected, but the translations of the God signs, they stand solid. Speaking in first person bothers me. So many times when speaking, I'll say we. Just wanted to get this all on record. So when I'm talking and referring to something that I found or whatever, I might say we, because I don't take any credit for this, people. I'm just the messenger. Now, may we move forward with the topic at hand. When the 4 worst fires and floods in state or U.S. history followed the crossing of the total eclipse within 3 months, the expected suddenly became the unexpected. Because the 7 spokes of the wheel had been spoken for by October, I will say no pun, and the remaining spoke took me back to 2005 when a blizzard hurricane was interpreted as the end of the world. And that was right here at Cape Cod. So this related to the line that I had drawn, the other leg of this X. From the time of the crossing of the total eclipse to the event in the Northeast, it had been a little over 4 months, but the new year, 2018, in the Northeast came in like a roaring lion, and the flooding ice was interpreted as the scene of a graveyard. The ice was swelling from the ground up. 13 years previously, it was the end of the world when ice and fire spears were shooting down out of the pit of darkness during daylight hours. So all the spokes of the wheel had now represented historical events. This is weather and the disclosed sex scandals. Hollywood's godlike Harvey Weinstein exposure was right after Hurricane Harvey hit Houston and the fire breakout in wine country had happened. Harvey, wine, W-E-I-N, and wine, W-I-N-E, show confirmation. These are God's warning signs. You can see with your eyes and hear with your ears. So out of the 8 legs, here's the bigger picture. 3 were fire. That's these 3 were fire. And they had power outages. So those people were living in darkness. And 3 were floods. That's here. This would be Houston. After Harvey left Houston, he traveled up this leg, and he ended up right back at the eye of the total eclipse, where Kentucky and Missouri had flooding, and so did Louisiana and Mississippi down here. And then Georgia and Charleston, South Carolina, they had floods as well, and so did Florida. That was Irma. So these 3 legs related to flooding, historical floods. And then this was the leg that related to the fire and the sex scandals as well. Came all the way down to D.C. Let's go back over this so we can really get it in our minds. We had 3 were fire, power outages, living in darkness. 3 were floods, power outages, living in darkness. And 1 was relative to the sex scandals, West and East Coast, L.A., New York, that was the TV anchors, and D.C. 6 congressmen left their position. So we could say they were living in darkness. The 8th leg proved to be 4 bombogenesis storms, power outages, living in darkness. Utilities were there from all over the U.S. for 3 to 4 months. The storms were over the day before Easter. That timing was enlightening. The world's worst solar storm took place shortly after the crossing of the total eclipse. You can watch this on LindaGaleOnCreation.com and see what the scientists interpreted as the world is going into a cold, dark age. See you there, and follow the sign in the explanation. Click on the button and it will take you to our conclusion.